About a third of Latinos who supported Donald Trump last year are not set on voting for a Republican during next year's midterms.
This victory was powered by the Latino vote. He came close to taking the majority.
Unless they see kind of a really notable improvement, that's kind of a risky position for the Trump administration to be in.
Hi, guys. Hey, Berend, how is Mexico treating you?
Good. I just feel like I'm missing a lot back in DC this week. It's kind of a busy
There's
one.
it certainly has. And, the biggest news, of course, is that we have Courtney back with us. Courtney, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. Glad to not be changing a diaper for once.
Incredible accomplishment of bringing another lovely little human into the world. So we're glad to have you back. And, if Bernd thinks that he missed a lot in 1 week, I'm sure it feels overwhelming to look back at the time that you've been gone. But what's that like coming back?
Yeah, I mean, everything's changed, but nothing's changed at all.
Yeah.
The way I've described it to people is the pace hasn't changed, but the amount of hours I sleep has. So it makes it a bit difficult these days, but I'm just trying to keep up, get my feet underneath me, and yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, of course, there's plenty for us to talk about this week. And we know that Presidents Trump and Putin are holding their massive meeting in Alaska. And we will, of course, be digging into all angles of that and President Trump's foreign policy priorities and strategy. Stay tuned for that next week for our listeners and viewers when we have a bit more of an idea of what the outcome is there. But we had, the three of us, been talking a bit before recording this pod and thought, let's spend an episode taking a bit of a closer look at a voting group that we talked about so much in the lead up to the 2024 election, which was Latino voters. And, we in the aftermath of the election also dissected how these voters cast their ballots. And, the big top line there, and Ben, you know this better than anyone as you covered the Latino vote so heavily, was that President Trump really had unprecedented success with this voting group.
He did, and now that we can kind of look back at the numbers, I think it's even more clear how significant that was over time compared to even from 2016 to last year. That huge jump and the share among the Democrats falling so much. I think it's fair to say that like one of the main factors in winning him the election, especially in those key states like Pennsylvania, for example.
And also on the border, right? You can't forget that, he actually performed really well in some of those border counties in Texas. I mean, as you said, Bern, like part of this victory was powered by the Latino vote. He came close to taking the majority, right? I think Pew put out a more comprehensive picture of the vote, and he came away with 48% of the Latino vote compared to Kamala Harris, who got 51 and obviously underperformed from 2020. But this was, I think, one of the biggest narratives of the 2024 election was just, not only how Trump performed, but also looking deeper into the Latino voter. They're not a monolith. They are shifting right, but that, they're a much more complex voting bloc than we have previously thought.
Yeah, and the reason we wanted to dig into this is because we have seen in these 8 months of President Trump's second term how many of the policies that he's focused on really are policies that he sold to Latino voters as being really important for their community in particular. So whether it's on the economy, something that really drove Latino voters, or immigration, these are issues that he has been front and center really for his first 8 months. So if we dig into the economy first, I mean, really, economic numbers, inflation, were seen as a key driver of why Latino voters moved towards President Trump in the last election. It's hard to say, obviously definitively, because as you said, Courtney, Latino voters are not a monolith. They're split by generation, by gender, by the region of Latin America their roots come from, and so on and so forth. But if you look at this as a bit of a voting bloc, obviously we don't have definitive polling, but there was a really interesting study that came out from Equus Research in July that said about a third of Latinos who supported Donald Trump last year are not set on voting for a Republican during next year's midterms. So let's start there then with the economy. Where do you guys see perhaps some of the strengths and weaknesses for President Trump among this voting bloc?
Well, I was just having a look at some of that data from some of those polls as well. And, particularly among Latino men under 40, some of the issues they raised were cost of living, inflation, housing, and healthcare costs. And I think unless they see kind of a really notable improvement over time, I mean, actually not that much time because the midterms are coming up, I think that's kind of a risky position for the Trump administration to be in, and that they have to show very definitively to that voting bloc that they've made improvements there in terms of inflation and cost of living, for example. And if they don't, I think that'll come back to haunt them.
I agree with you, Bern. I think that, the number one issue from Latino voters I spoke to, I actually, during the 2024 campaign, shadowed Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who was the campaign manager for Biden before he stepped out of the race, out in California. And we met with a bunch of Latino voters, and just listening to them, the main takeaway was, just paying for those everyday basic needs. It really comes down to grocery prices, right? And like, Trump, part of his campaign promise was bringing these prices down. We haven't seen that happen. We've seen a lot of market turmoil, with the tariffs. And I think there's just that general unease about the economy. And I think, there's a wait and see approach, of course. But yeah, as Bern said, they're running out of time because 2026 is right around the corner.
And to that point, just one of the criticism of the Dems in this last election, and actually in the last couple elections, was that they didn't focus on those sort of everyday economic issues, and focused on social issues, which really didn't prove to be that much of a winner among Latino voters. I think if they did the opposite now and focused on those economics where they see that Trump perhaps hasn't delivered to people's satisfaction, I think that could really benefit the Democrats if they were to go down that way.
Well, President Trump and his administration, they have been very keen to point out what they see as really good economic data. They put out, more press statements saying, look, wages are rising. And we got those more recent numbers on inflation on the consumer price index that saw better than expected numbers on inflation staying relatively similar to where it was. The reality is, however, if some of those larger tariff numbers go into effect, and we've seen some of them announced, for example, on goods from Brazil affecting coffee imports, if they go into effect and start to really drive inflation up, that's where you could see, for this voting bloc where the economy, inflation, prices of everyday goods are so critical, at least that's what they voiced ahead of the election, as you guys said, that could be where we see to start to see them turn a bit.
Some of that polling that you were speaking about earlier, the Equus polling, really paints a picture as well. I mean, one of the lines that stood out to me was that, a majority of Latinos, 64%, rated the economy, the current U.S. economy, somewhat or very poor, and only 34% saw it as somewhat or very good. So, this they're not changing their stance in terms of, now that we are seeing President Trump implement some of these policies, things aren't getting better for them. They're very pessimistic. They were already skeptical of Democrats. Now they're skeptical of Republicans. They've sort of grown disillusioned with both parties at this juncture.
And I also think more broadly, I mean, if the economic impact of, for example, immigration enforcement, a lot of Latino, especially Latino men around the country, are employed in industries like construction or agriculture. If those industries start to feel a pinch because of the Trump administration's policies, I think that just kind of adds to the general feeling of economic unease a lot of people are starting to have within that community.
And that brings us to such an important aspect of how Latino voters might be viewing President Trump now, more than 8 months into his second term, is immigration policy. Look, I think we heard the criticism from analysts of the Latino vote that Democrats, they believed in the 2024 election, focused far too much on what they assumed would be a pro-immigration policy among Latino communities across the U.S. And the reality is they didn't understand some of the complexities there among the different voting tendencies, let's say, and some of those male Latino voters in particular moving right. But It's really interesting to see Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona, who we talked about last week on the pod. You know, I saw him say in an interview that he did with CBS News a month or two ago, he said, look, I see Latino men and Latino voters who cast their ballots for Donald Trump having buyer's remorse because they're saying this is not what I voted for. We wanted border security and deportations, but not the way it's being done now, not the way that is disrupting our communities entirely. So I guess we should start with border versus, deportations and ICE roundups. But where do you see this coming down among Latino voters?
Well, I think if one looks at the border just as its own issue, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a Trump supporter, Latino or otherwise, who isn't convinced that he's done exactly what he said he would do. I mean, just looking at the numbers of detentions at the border, the number of people released into the United States, which the White House Caroline Levitt mentions those numbers at the top of every single briefing without fail every time. So I think it's hard not to frame that as a promise is kept by the White House. I think where it gets more complicated is in the deportations because there's some communities that were, very Trump leaning in the election. Let's say Venezuelans in South Florida or Cubans that might be having buyer's remorse now because of things such as temporary protected status for Venezuelans being taken away, some of the parole programs for Cubans. I mean, these are communities that almost reflexively are anti-left in any way. And, many of them feel and are saying that they feel quite let down by those, domestic immigration enforcement policies.
I also think that there was sort of a disconnect with what Trump was saying when he was talking about mass deportations and deporting, criminals, undocumented immigrants with criminal records, right? And versus, maybe Latino voters who are third, fourth generation don't necessarily view themselves as part of the immigrant community in the way that they thought the president was speaking about. And so, it's one thing, as Byrne said, when he's talking about deporting criminals, but it's another thing when we're seeing these sort of mass roundups. We're seeing, ICE raids on farms and restaurants and hotels. And, as you said, in some of these communities, particularly in South Florida, we see ICE, walking around and people, there's a sense of fear, right? That maybe they didn't think was going to be the case when the president was on the campaign trail. And they didn't see that as something that would affect them personally. But yeah, there's like a sense of betrayal there. If you talk to, some Latino voters who didn't sort of see it playing out this way. And I think the big question is how does this all manifest next year at the ballot box in the midterm elections? And, will some of these more rigorous immigration policies, turn people away from Republicans who, they'll be voting for or not voting for?
I mean, it's important to say that in South Texas, where you saw a significant swing towards President Trump, these are the regions along the border that saw a massive influx of migrants over the last few years before President Biden and his administration issued their executive order to crack down on immigration at the southern border. And, these are communities that will be likely, based on the voting patterns, very happy with the numbers that the White House, as you guys said, is very keen to mention, which is that they've been very successful in shutting down those illegal crossings at the border. On the larger deportations question, I was looking back at some of the executive orders that President Trump had issued right when he came into office to understand how some of those targeted immigration and might affect those communities. So there was the executive order suspending the entry of undocumented migrants under any circumstances. So clearly that's had a very clear impact on those border crossings. There was also canceling the use of the CPB-1 smartphone app. So that allowed people who were in Mexican territory to schedule appointments at the U.S. border ports for legal entry into the country. I thought a bit about that and how perhaps for those Latino communities in the U.S. who are advocating for legal pathways into the U.S., that might be a sign that those are drying up, closing up, something that might give them pause. And then there was the executive order that's faced multiple challenges, which has been temporarily blocked by a federal judge to undo birthright citizenship. And that really digs deep into the American identity of some of these Latino communities who have been here generations. And I think that might have been a bit of a warning sign for some of these communities in particular, because they really obviously identify with American culture and with American voting patterns. You've seen Latino analysts say, treat Latino voters like any other voting bloc. They don't necessarily vote along certain lines that you might have thought in previous years. But yeah, I mean, I wonder if that's going to perhaps have more of an impact than those border executive orders that I mentioned.
And I think it's interesting how we're starting to see. I mean, even from within the Republican Party, we're starting to see pushback in terms of some of those policies. For example, Rep. Elmira Salazar, Florida Republican, introduced legislation to create a pathway to citizenship, essentially for undocumented immigrants who had been in the U.S. a long time, which from the administration standpoint, they seem to be moving away from that suggestion. It's not really even been a topic of conversation at the White House these last 8 months. So I think there's, in birthright citizenship as well, you're starting to see a lot more internal pushback from elected Republicans because they're ultimately going to have to answer to, in some cases, very heavily Latino constituencies in the next year.
Yeah, and speaking of upcoming elections, one of the biggest stories that I'm sure you guys have talked about before I came back, but the redistricting in Texas, and 4 of the 5 counties that the Republicans are trying to redraw district lines around are majority Hispanic. So they really are going to play again a major role in shaping the outcome of 2026, and it's the Trump policies that are going to bear out. And he's not on the ballot. Will this transcend? And will Republicans be able to answer for some of the questions around some of these policies they don't necessarily agree with?
But at the same time, I guess the question is, President Trump can say, look, the border is safe. We have rounded up what he calls, criminals and terrorists, and have sent them in some cases to third countries. I am creating a safe country again. And I wonder if that does resonate with many of the Latino communities who asked for precisely that.
I think it does up into a point, but then, for example, if you look at it from the standpoint of Venezuelan Americans in Florida, the United States might be getting safer, but at the same time, they're deporting people back to the same kind of heavy-handed authoritarian left-wing government that they fled, a generation ago or more recently even. So, I mean, both those things can be true, that the U.S. could be getting safer and that many of these communities will recognize that. And then you're also deporting people back to situations, that they themselves fled or their parents fled or grandparents fled. So I think it's kind of a tricky balancing act.
I wonder if that, people start to draw the lines, like you're saying, like they have these sort of profound visuals in LA of the National Guard and, these ICE raids, right? And does that feel familiar to some of these Latino communities about, authoritarianism in Cuba, in El Salvador, in Venezuela, as you're saying? Like, are they going to start to draw the line, or, can they keep that separate and maintain, 2 different sort of worlds that they're living, or that they know, and the one that they're living in?
With regards to that, the key question is kind of what lessons that the Democrats might have picked up last year that they can implement in the midterms. But I mean, but as of now, there's people, within the Democratic Party and, observers of the Latino community that said, they still haven't really changed how they're going about messaging people. It's still kind of a one size fits all approach across the country. Spanish language outreach perhaps isn't as good as it needs to be. There's still a focus on social issues rather than the economy. There's a perception that Latinos are often, kind of pandered to only about immigration. I don't think that's necessarily gone away. So, I suppose, the main thing I'll be looking for next year is what lessons the Democrats actually picked up and what they're actually doing differently this time around, if they want to take advantage of if some of that sheen has worn off.
One of the things that really stuck with me when I was reporting and on the trail was speaking to a Latino voter who said, "I just want to see the Democrats fight. I want to see them actually fight back in a way that, maybe meeting some of Trump's rhetoric with that sort of rhetoric." And the voter I was speaking to was saying he just felt like they weren't trying, right? And so, is that something that we'll see? How are they going to sort of step up their game and be a bit more aggressive in trying to reach these voters and actually change the messaging to meet them, where they're at with addressing these sort of everyday basic needs, addressing, healthcare, paycheck, wages, right? These sort of everyday issues that really Donald Trump was able to break through on the campaign trail in a way that Kamala Harris was just not.
Yeah, and I think, it's also going to be really interesting to see how President Trump positions himself. We've mentioned the fact that he's not on the ballot, but he obviously is keen to communicate all of what he sees as his successes in these first 8 months. And, he was really proud of the accomplishment of, almost winning outright the Latino vote, which is truly remarkable if you think about how traditionally Latinos have voted for Democrats. And they, Republicans who will be on the ballot will be very, very closely looking at the successes that President Trump had and looking at how they can replicate those.
And one thing I've found really puzzling covering the White House these last 8 months, there really hasn't been any dedicated outreach on the part of the White House to Latino voters.
Mm.
There's someone who's in charge of outreach to Black and Latino voters, which are two very different things. Which I think they're kind of leaving cards on the table in that regard. And they've also taken away any sort of Spanish language outreach. There's no more Spanish language function on the White House website, for example. On one hand, it is, the White House's argument would be that they're approaching everyone in the same way as Americans, but there are a lot of conservative Latino communities in the United States that prefer to get their news and updates in Spanish. And I think by not reaching out there, I think the White House is perhaps missing, part of the equation. And one wonders if they're not going to have to relook at that next year when Trump might not be on the ballot, but certainly his policies will be on the ballot in a lot of these communities.
And I think, one of the big takeaways I had in speaking with, political analysts who have been studying this issue for years, speaking with voters themselves, is these are one of the true swing voting blocks, right? They are not, necessarily loyal to one party over the other. And so there's a real opportunity for both parties, particularly because, if you look at some of the polling, so many of Latino voters are willing to vote one way at the top of the ticket and then split the ticket and vote for another party, down ballot. And so how that's going to bear out next year, again, I know we keep coming back to the 2026 midterms because I do really think we'll get some real answers about where Latino voters are and where this community or, the several communities that make up the Latino voting bloc are, moving beyond 2024. And part of that is, they are frustrated with both parties, but who, as you said, who is going to be the person or the people that are going to emerge and sway them in one direction or another?
We'll have a few mini tests in the meantime before then, things like the gubernatorial elections in Virginia and New Jersey, but those are particular states, obviously. The mayoral race in New York, but New York City is always its own beast, so not clear how much you can extrapolate from that for the rest of the country. But something we'll continue to keep our eye on here on the pod. And of course, next week we'll be diving deep into all of the foreign policy questions that will arise from the weekend's summit between Presidents Putin and Trump. But great to see you both again. And we'll see each other again next week.
See you guys.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk. uk.